why we should ignore Phil Christie's view that pathological demand avoidance is an autism spectrum disorder. This is just a quick video to discuss the kind of main fundamental logic and rationale behind why PDA is viewed as autism. I'll kind of explain how it's mainly kind of viewed that way under by sending out the kind of the views of Phil Christie, who's some would argue is the leading PDA expert, and then I'll kind of explain some issues with these arguments by setting out Newton's views and Newton's work, then kind of contextualizing wider arguments to kind of show that most of the arguments being put forward by Phil Christie that PDA is an ASD. Well, I don't like the term ASD. Just a quick note on terminology. In the slides I put ASD in, but that's just for me to kind of take up less space. I will just tend to use autism throughout the actual video to refer to the autism spectrum in its entirety. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there and just kind of get on with it. So this is just a bit more about me, which I should have probably given in my first video. So yes, I am diagnosed as autistic in 2012 at the Class Clinic in Cambridge. My specific diagnosis is Asperger's, but I just tend to use autism, which will kind of... The main reason I tend to use autism is just because we know that autism subtypes just do not hold up empirically or clinically, which is kind of an important point, which I'll get onto later. Yes, I meet Lisbon Neeson's Pda behaviour profile. I can go into great detail how I do meet it, but I don't feel the need for me to kind of disclose personal information about my medical records to kind of do that. Yeah, just because someone meets a Pda profile, it doesn't really mean much, because there's a lot of inconsistencies around how PDA is diagnosed. There's no agreed method over how to diagnose it or what it is, and other kind of factors. I'm a PhD student at London South Bank. My PhD is on PDA. I'm a lateral thinker and not a longitudinal, so I'm very good at kind of information matching and pulling things together, and very good at kind of cross-pollinating ideas. And I have quite a good research portfolio of kind of conference talks and articles and book chapters, mainly centering on critical autism studies and PDA. And yeah, Autism Policy of Practice is an autism-led good practice journal that I am acting chief editor on. So please do kind of contact me if you'd like to be involved with that. I have previously covered a bit of the introduction and what this video is going to contain. I'm going to briefly mention the kind of the main discussion points around conceptualizing PDA as an autism spectrum disorder, as argued by Phil Christie. There's quite good reasons to kind of think that is nonsense, which I'll go into later in the talk, and I will kind of end with just brief conclusions in the talk. Yes, so the main Pda discourse. PDA is either called pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance. So that's either PDA for short or EDA for short. It is viewed as a distinct autism subgroup or an autism subtype or an autism profile. The language varies depending on when you look in literature and who's saying it. It was also originally viewed to be a pervasive developmental disorder, or a PDD for short, and that PDA has its own set of unique strategies that are different to autism's and different for kind of more traditional or more straightforward kind of autism kind of presentations. And I was kind of saying traditional and more straightforward in quotation marks. This is the autism and PDA traits dual diagnosis. This is my view on how they're kind of operationalized and how they are similar and how they're different. Some people might disagree, although no one's really kind of come to me and said where I'm wrong on the topic. On the left-hand side, you have the DSM-5 autism criteria, and on the right hand side you have what I would call the aggregated Pda profile. The reason for this is there's about 4 or 5 different Pda profiles in print, so I've aggregated them together into one behaviour profile for ease of reference. So what you should be able to see is that there are 2 main areas of overlap between PDA and autism, and this is in the social communication issues and on the early onset criteria. But there are kind of key differences between PDA and autism in both areas. So, for example, the social communication issues one, autism has 3 social communication issue traits compared to PDA's 1, which is surface sociability. I have made this trait optional in my own view, primarily because many of the options in it either do not reliably measure the social communication issues in PDA, or many of the issues are actually features that should be associated to repetitive behaviours and interests. So that would be RRBIs. So, for example, panic attacks were viewed as being part of surface sociability, but they should probably belong to lability of mood, which is an RRBI trait under PDA. The reason why autism PDA social communication issues overlap is that for PDA, it's meant to have no problems with theory of mind or empathy, so it's meant to have no deficits in that area. And some autistic people can and do pass theory of mind tests. For example, 20% in the original 1985 paper, 2% of the autistic people passed the Sally-Ann test. So that's why I've got them overlapping it. The other area where overlap is in the age of early onset. I've got those overlapping primarily because one study that researched PDA viewed it to be neurodevelopmental in nature, and also viewed PDA to be part of the autism spectrum. So they basically said it has sensory issues, which would overlap the DSM-5 autism profile. So that would be like B4 on the autism one. So that's what overlapping. The main bit of divergence is around the nature of the RRBIs. I've not drawn them overlapping because the PDA RRBIs are associated with anxiety, and it is accepted within kind of clinical practice that if an RRBI is due to anxiety or fear, it's not part of autism. It's part of something else. So due to that, I've separated them out. The PDA literature is quite clear. It is problematic, putting it mildly, to view PDA as part of the autism spectrum. This has been kind of noted in there more frequently in the early PDA literature than compared to now. But the first one to kind of make out is that there are meant to be differences between the autism and PDA strategy. So for the PDA ones, they include using novelty, spontaneity, and humour. These features contradict the traditional autism strategies when you're working with autistic people. The fantasy roleplay PDA trait differs from autism because if it is viewed that autistic people tend to lack fantasy or roleplay, or it kind of develops later compared to non-autistic people. So the gender ratio for PDA tends to be more balanced between the genders males versus females. This is meant to set it out apart from autism. A more recent one is that various studies are indicating that PDA has a high rate of child and young persons not meeting clinical threshold as they basically develop. So they will display less PDA features and behaviours as they mature into adulthood. And when you compare these rates versus autism, PDA is substantially higher. There are a few more issues that kind of make PDA problematic, viewing it as part of the autism spectrum. the first point on this slide is kind of well recognised in the Pda literature and referenced by multiple authors. The first point of this is that the sheer variety and frequency of manipulative behaviours displayed by persons with PDA, this is clinically different from autistic people. The next point is, as I mentioned a couple of slides back, the social communication issues in PDA are meant to be due to deficits in pride, shame, and social identity, and this cause of social communication issues is different from autism. And this is a point of divergence between PDA and autism. The last point, which is kind of arguably the most important one, is that PDA fundamentally is argued to be an anxiety-driven construct, an anxiety-driven disorder. So that, for example, frequently people with PDA, they will disassociate or adapt kind of roles or do fantasy and role play as a way of escaping demands. Is viewed as a coping mechanism from the high anxiety, and this is actually quite important because anxiety, while it can be experienced quite frequently in autistic people, is not an intrinsic part of autism. It's viewed as a co-occurring condition to autism, and this is mentioned quite a few times in the PDA literature and by kind of many PDA's supporters. The final few points that kind of make it hard for PDA to view autism is that some authors have argued that PDA behaviours may not be caused by autism itself. To me, this is quite kind of clear. If PDA is not caused by autism, it cannot be part of the autism spectrum. That should be obvious to most people. The next point is that PDA may be what is referred to as a triple hit. So one small-scale study found that kind of PDA could be described as being represented by features of autism, conduct problems, and anxiety. Which the problem with this is that PDA contains features that is seen outside of the autism spectrum, and again can't be autism. This is kind of just basic logic. A plus B plus C cannot equal A. This is kind of quite simple stuff, and the kind of more kind of pertinent point in my view is that many experts have expressed in the PDA literature that PDA is seen outside of autism, and I would even argue that Newton herself has said this, indirectly, but I'll kind of get onto that later. There is some limited evidence to suggest that PDA is seen in non-autistic people, but I discussed this more on my previous video. I'm going to be spending the next few slides just detailing why Phil Christie argues PDA is autism in relation towards how it goes about doing this. So this is kind of a very important starting point, is this diagram by Elizabeth Newton called the Family of Pervasive Developmental Disorders, which can sometimes be called the Autism Spectrum, which can be used to refer to the entire group. This version is from 1999, and it is quite important because this diagram itself seems to be an intermediary diagram in between Newton's previous views on how you would diagnostically group PDA and her last known version of it. And this version, you could argue, is not representative of Newton's more consistent views on the topic. But it's also kind of important because this diagram has autistic disorder and Asperger Syndrome, which were two pervasive developmental disorders, but they were accepted to be forms of autism and PDA, and PDA is drawn separately. But on the bottom right hand corner of the diagram, the in kind of a dotted border is specific language impairments. This is actually fully blocked in Newton's last version of this diagram, which Christie doesn't draw upon. What this diagram actually represents is clusters of symptoms. So what Newton is saying here is that each clustering of symptoms is a distinct syndrome, and she's saying in this diagram that Asperger syndrome overlaps autistic disorder, and that they're both based on childhood impairment. Or PDA is separate and independent from from Asperger's and autistic disorder, and is not based on childhood impairment. It quickly has six clustering symptoms in there. But this diagram is quite important to Christie's arguments around why PDA is autism. So in his 2007 article, Christie kind of explains the rationale behind why we should place PDA within the autism spectrum. He starts off this section by admitting that PDA is controversial, partly because it does not conform to conventional understandings of autism. He goes on to say that Newton viewed PDA to be a pervasive developmental disorder, which is true, but there's more subtleties to it, which I'll get into later. He then goes on to say that pervasive developmental disorders are sometimes called the Autism Spectrum Disorders, as mentioned by Newton, and that ASDs are based on the triad of impairment. I should clarify what the triad of impairment is. A triad of impairment contains 3 areas of limited kind of functioning. So that one will be based in RRBIs, and another one will be based on interacting with the people, and one is having impaired kind of social imagination. But they've since been collapsed down into just social communication issues and RRBIs, and that's because research showed that there isn't much difference between the 2 social communication areas of the triad of impairment. But that's a topic. Christie also kind of argues that there is a broader autism phenotype, so that basically the autism spectrum is actually much broader than what is diagnosed in clinical practice. But yeah. So other pertinent points that Christie makes in this section of the article, because around kind of PDA being part of the autism spectrum, is that there are almost certainly autism subtypes, so that there are multiple autisms. What he means by this is that currently autism is viewed as a heterogeneous condition, and that's basically cannot be subdivided. But what Christie's argument within his article is that you can make discrete kind of relatively homogeneous kind of syndromes within the kind of autism spectrum, and he is arguing that PDA should be viewed as one of them within the kind of broader autism phenotype. So he then goes on to argue that the different kind of autism subtypes will have different kind of clinical needs, and therefore different strategies are needed to be used with individuals who possess the different kind of autism subtypes. He explains how the public often conflates the pervasive developmental disorders umbrella with the autism spectrum. He also kind of mentions that the autism spectrum disorders and pervasive mental disorders are similar because they both have restricted and repetitive behaviours and interests and social communication issues, but they are not the same thing. And he, Phil Christie would argue that we should just kind of airbrush over the differences between PDDs and ASDs and just view PDA as an ASD. But I will kind of point out it can't be done as straightforward as that. So Christie ends this section by arguing that a protracted debate over what PDA is, how it should be viewed diagnostically and clinically, is a distraction over. It distracts from the true purpose of diagnosing PDA. It distracts from the true purpose of using diagnostic entities like PDA or Asperger Syndrome or ADHD or OCD in clinical practice. And the true purpose of such diagnoses is to provide a better understanding of a person's kind of actions and features, and to be able to provide better kind of support strategies to support a person. So I would counter-argue and point out that if you're too busy focusing on just diagnosing PDA and not spending sufficient time considering what PDA could be, you'll be distracting yourself from considering which clinical populations, which individuals should receive a PDA diagnosis in the first place. And this is quite important. When you can consider the ethics around PDA, which I kind of covered in my previous video. This diagram is important because it is Elizabeth Newton's last diagram on how you should clinically group PDA and how it relates to the autism spectrum. So you should be able to see that this differs from the previous 1999 diagram, and that one important area of difference is that the specific language impairments, the bottom right syndrome, is fully included. There are some other minor differences between the two diagrams, but this is one of the main points of divergence. Again, each kind of circle represents a distinct syndrome, a distinct clustering of symptoms. I will go in and in the next slide I will discuss important ramifications of this diagram. I have kind of covered some of these points before previously. I will restate them just for kind of ease of clarity. So in the previous slide, the diagram of how Nathan kind of views PDA and how she views the pervasive developmental disorders, she has autistic disorder and Asperger syndrome based on the triad of impairment, and they are drawn overlapping each other. This cannot be said about PDA. It is clearly drawn separately from autism and Asperger syndrome and from specific language impairments. She argues that they are connected via various genetic and environmental links and factors. But PDA is viewed as being its own separate syndrome within the pervasive developmental disorders diagnostic grouping. There are important areas of divergence between Newson's conceptualization of the pervasive developmental disorders and what was accepted within the DSM-4. The DSM-4 was one of the main, was a previous iteration of one of the main diagnostic manuals. I'm not going to pronounce his name because it's something like the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, which was used between 1994 until 2013. Technically, there was a revised edition that came out in the year 2000, but that's a tangent. But what I'm trying to say is here is that Newson recognised the descriptors for pervasive developmental disorders that were used by the DSM-4, and she argued, and she used it when describing PDA with caregivers. This information is provided in the supplementary notes to Newson et al. 2003. She quite clearly argues in there that there is a distinct difference between pervasive developmental disorders as how she sees it and the autism spectrum. She views the autism spectrum as being as being half or a smaller grouping of syndromes within the pervasive developmental disorders. So she views the autism spectrum as represented by autistic disorder and Asperger syndrome. But she distinctly goes on to say that PDA is not an autism spectrum disorder, and that it would be a mistake to call PDA an autism spectrum disorder, saying that it would be akin to describing an entire family group based on the name of one of its family members, essentially. And there is clearly differences because within the DSM-4, which Newton's using the descriptors from, the pervasive developmental disorders grouping, it has 5 diagnoses in there. 2 of them are autistic disorder and Asperger syndrome. Over 2, which isn't included in Newton's grouping, is childhood disintegrative disorder and Rett syndrome. And the last one is a residual category. So people who make diagnostic manuals, they accept that people don't fit easily into boxes. So they'll give each diagnostic grouping a residual category for people to fall into if they do not meet clinical threshold for certain diagnoses. So in the DSM-4, it was pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or PD-NODS. But the definition of that within the DSM-4 is that it is a residual diagnosis for those not meeting clinical threshold for either autistic disorder or Asperger syndrome. Newson's definition for PD-NODS is actually clinically broader. So Newson's definition of it is anyone who does not meet clinical threshold for either autistic disorder, Asperger syndrome, PDA, or specific language impairments. And this is quite important. This is clinically broad because it includes non-autistic people. It includes non-autistic people in those who have PDA and those who have specific language impairments. So this is a key point of divergence. Newton also argues that she's argued this quite consistently throughout her work, that those who have a pervasive developmental disorder, that the issues that they experience is entirely caused by biological genetic factors, and we know this has not been the case. It is accepted that no mental disorder within the DSM-5, which is the latest version of the DSM, but no diagnosis in there is entirely caused by genetic or biological factors. No disorder within the DSM has any feature that can be used to diagnose it from biological or genetic factors. And the key point is that this situation is not expected to change anytime soon. So yeah, it's just important to kind of note the kind of things that Newton kind of is correct, also that she's just wrong on, or probably wrong. Yes, so these are the definitions for pervasive developmental and disorder, which Newton used throughout her work. I've taken these definitions from conference talks that Phil Christie has consistently used over the last several years. And Christie would say that these definitions were also relevant to the second of the main diagnostic manuals, which is the ICD-10, which is the previous edition of it. The short abridged name for it is kind of the International Classification of for Diseases, but these ones are mainly for the DSM-4. So the first definition for pervasive, pervasive suggests that the effects can be seen in all the child's development. The definition for developmental means that the disorder is present at birth, gradually becoming apparent during the course of development. And the definition for disorder it implies more than a straightforward delay. Main real comment on these three is the definition for developmental is circular because it's got development in it. The other main point to point out is that Newton consistently argued that anyone who has a pervasive developmental disorder would have coding issues as part of that. So a coding issue is when a person cannot process or understand certain aspects of communication. So so Newton kind of consistently kind of argues this throughout her kind of work, and there are reasons for this, which I'll kind of go on to next. As part of my comments about the 1999 diagram by Newton is that it was an in-between diagram. So before that one, Newton used this diagram. It's actually really quite interesting when you kind of engage with it. So in 1986, Newton created her own diagnostic grouping, and she called it Pervasive Developmental Coding Disorders. And this is the main reason why PDA and Newton's Pervasive Developmental Disorders grouping has 4 descriptors to it. So Newton created her own diagnostic group in 1986 for 2-3 main reasons. The main one being that she thought that the autism spectrum was too narrowly defined, and that she wanted something to be more broader and more useful to laypersons. And she argued that her own pervasive developmental disorder, her own pervasive developmental coding disorders diagnostic grouping makes more sense to laypersons, including caregivers. There are some interesting aspects to note about it. So you will notice from it that it contains autism, PDA, dyslexia, and dysphagia. Dysphagia is sometimes called aphasia today, but when you kind of look at it, it is essentially the same diagram that we actually kind of use later throughout it. And I kind of explained what she did later. But some interesting points to point out about it is the density of the dots within each of the circles within each of the syndromes represents the intensity of the symptoms expressed in the person. So the more dots there are, the more impaired a person is. And there's also a bar for kind of intellect, for intellectual potential within it. Newton also has links between the 4 syndromes. So yeah, one point I would point out that's kind of really quite telling is that Newton questions what the coding issues are for PDA in this diagram. This diagram was created in March 1986, and it's important because Newton created her first behaviour profile for PDA in 1988. So 2 years before she's actually defining it clinically for diagnostic purposes. She's questioning what is the coding issues with it. The main reason for this is for this diagram from Newton's perspective is that she worked over 2 clinics over her kind of clinical practice, so from the 1970s through to like the 2000s, and these specialised in coding issues. So she would have been seeing people who had dyslexia, who had dysphagia, who had Pda, who had autism. I'd point out that the autism cluster includes Asperger Syndrome, because she viewed the difference between Asperger's and autism as, I mean like DSM-4 autism, but I mean autistic disorder, as basically intelligence. So Asperger's will have average or above average intelligence, which one of the reasons why Asperger's was removed from the DSM-5 was because the intellectual kind of characteristics of those diagnosed with Asperger's was not consistent across the entire group. So yeah, I will kind of move on to the next slide and discuss this grouping in a bit more detail. I'm not going to really retread ground on this point. I discussed these points in the previous slides discussion. Yes, so this is Newton's last diagram for pervasive developmental disorders again, and it's just here just to kind of highlight some of the consistency of Newton's views, but also kind of point out some differences between the 2 diagrams. So in pervasive developmental coding disorders diagram, she has autism collapsed into one symptom cluster, while in the last diagram, she has taken out Asperger Syndrome from autistic disorder while still having them overlapping and based on the childhood impairment, which she could not previously do because she just showed symptom kind of intensity in a previous diagram, while in the last diagram she kind of details what symptoms are present, which I think is a more useful way of displaying PDA and autism respectively. What she also does quite importantly is that she has collapsed dysphagia and dyslexia together into specific language impairment, which is quite important. It's also important to note that she only draws specific language impairments with a single symptom domain, which is encoding issues. So she's saying that specific language impairments have no RRBIs issues, and this will become important later when pointing out how Newton's pervasive developmental disorders are not the same as the DSM-4. I have covered most of these points before. I've mentioned how the pervasive developmental disorders still have coding issues left over from Newton's first diagnostic grouping. This kind of has important ramifications. What it means is that Newton's pervasive developmental disorders group is essentially still the same diagnostic grouping that she was using in the late 80s and to the mid 90s. So it's essentially still the pervasive mental disorders. It is still the pervasive mental coding disorders diagnostic grouping. What this means in practice is that PDA is a new type of mental disorder, which I think is actually really important to kind of consider when conceptualizing PDA and working with it. There are important ramifications from how Newton conceptualized pervasive mental disorders. And there's important ramifications from Newton's own scholarship for why you cannot view PDA to be part of the autism spectrum. I covered these points more in my previous video, so I'm not going to cover all of them again. So if you want to watch that, I click on the link in the description to it. But yeah, I mean, Newton did things like not basing PDA on a childhood impairment, and she could have, if Newton wanted PDA to conform to autism understandings, she would have made it conform to autism understandings. But she did things like screen for autism features and exclude cases that showed even atypical features of autism from her database. Yeah, and I've already previously mentioned how about Newton saying that Pda should not be viewed as part of the autism spectrum. But she quite clearly states in her first publication on topic in 1983 that people with a person with Pda are not autistic and they should not be kind of viewed that way. As mentioned in my previous talk about the ethics of Pda, Newton's database was many of the referrals were for people who would typically be diagnosed with either atypical autism or pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. These are two residual categories for autism. So it would have been for people who would not have met clinical threshold for an autism diagnosis. But this was not universally the case. So what this means is, in practice, is that Newton's database contains non-autistic people in. I also previously mentioned about how it is argued that not all people who were in Newton's database and were diagnosed with Pda would have received a modern DSM-5 autism diagnosis. So the implication is that Newton had non-autistic people in there. What that means is that you cannot argue that Pda is autism from Newton's work. It's one of many reasons why. But I discussed this in kind of the broader ethical issues talk in the previous video. Specific language impairments are crucial to discussing Newton's conceptualizations for pervasive developmental disorders and Pda being part of the autism spectrum. The reason for this is that one, specific language impairments do not have RBIs. What this means is that Newton's conceptualizations for pervasive developmental disorders do not conform to accepted understandings for pervasive developmental disorders, that they must have social communication issues and RBIs, as mentioned by Christie. The other point to note is that if you're going to view Pda to be part of the autism spectrum because it was a pervasive mental disorder, you would also logically be including specific language impairments in the autism spectrum as well. And what this would mean in practice is that you'll be adding millions of people to the autism spectrum who are not autistic. The reason we know this is because specific language impairments are not recognised to be autism, and the prevalence rate is between 3 to 7% of the human population. So this is quite important to consider when you're just arbitrarily adding pervasive mental disorders from Newton's work to the autism spectrum, or attempting to. And Phil Christie does not mention this or discuss this in his work, from what I've seen or heard from attending two conferences which he has spoken at. We're kind of getting on to important points that have been made towards removing autism subtypes from clinical practice and from the diagnostic manuals. So the committee that decided what autism was and how it was kind of portrayed within the main diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, they were called the Neurodevelopmental Disorders Work Group. And one of the reasons I removed subtypes around autism from the DSM-5 was because there was no evidence for differential treatment between autism subtypes. And this is quite important because it directly contradicts one of Christie's rationale for Pda being an autism subtype, is that autism subtypes exist and that they must have different needs and therefore must have different strategies from one another. From what we know, from what the evidence tells us, is that this is just not the case. And also another point to mention now is that clinically and diagnostically it has been impossible to successfully divide autism. I kind of discussed this more in my kind of journal articles, especially ones from last year, like 2019. It's that all attempts, both based on behavioural methods and biomarker methods, have failed to successfully divide autism. It's one of the reasons why autism is viewed as a heterogeneous diagnostic entity. And bear in mind, this isn't just like one or two studies. This is like millions of pounds worth of research, decades worth of research, thousands of man hours, and probably hundreds of thousands of researchers and clinicians attempting to divide autism, and they have failed. And this is a huge, substantial body of evidence that tells us that autism cannot be cannot be clinically divided. The last point on this slide is to say that one of the reasons why subtypes were removed was to remove stigma for all autistic persons. This is partly done under lobbying by autistic people, mainly by by ASAN in America. So ASAN stands for the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. They pointed out that due to how autism subtypes were being inconsistently diagnosed, so they weren't being consistently diagnosed across various clinics, and there is research to kind of support this. It meant that the subtype the person would be given would basically be random compared to other people. So what this means is that certain autistic people would experience more levels of stigma compared to other ones purely based on the clinic they attended. So the way to kind of get away from this kind of issue and the impact of stigma is just to have a single blanket autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. We're kind of getting onto some other important points about the logic around Christie's arguments for PDA being part of the autism spectrum. And one point that is often kind of said to me by PDA is an autism spectrum disorder supporters is that under DSM-5, the Pervasive Developmental Disorders diagnostic term was just removed and just replaced by a single autism spectrum disorder diagnosis and a residual category of social communication disorder. But most people tend to use autism spectrum disorder in clinical practice. So what they will tell me is, as Newson called PDA pervasive mental disorder, PDA must now be autism. The problem in this is that only well-established pervasive mental disorders were grandfathered into the DSM-5. What this means is only the 3 accepted autism subtypes from the DSM-4 were grandfathered into it. So this would be PD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, autistic disorder, and Asperger Syndrome. PDA is not a well-established pervasive mental disorder. So it is not covered by it. And as I said previously, PDA does not conform to autism understandings, and that PDA and that Newson's pervasive mental disorders diagnostic grouping is not the same as it is for PDDs. It actually includes non-autistic people in it. I've also been told by someone who's involved with setting the DSM-5 autism criteria, so a person who was a member of the neurodevelopmental disorders work group, that PDA was actually considered for inclusion and was discarded due to a lack of evidence for it. The last point to kind of make on this slide is, well, last couple of points, is that Christie kind of refers to kind of broader autism phenotype. The assumption behind broader autism phenotype is that it is for kind of subclinical autism, it's for people who have autism features but do not meet kind of clinical threshold for it. So that is mainly seen in kind of family members of those who, it's mainly seen in family members of autistic people, so seen in those who are diagnosed as autistic. The problem with this is that there is no real consensus over what broader autism phenotype actually is. Nick Chow and I would argues quite persuasively it is a result of people just collectively assuming they know what it is, and then they just assume that it's the same thing. It's not really clinically defined, and this has been pointed out in a recent article reviewed by a couple of people who were involved in the neurodevelopmental disorders work group. They basically said that there was no established consensus definition for the broader autism phenotype, or for it to be there's no consensus over what it is to be included in the diagnostic manuals as well. And these two people are Fred Volkmar, who was involved in it and left the neurodevelopmental disorders work group. He left it for various reasons, but the other author was Catherine Nord, who headed the actual group. So these are people who can kind of say this quite definitively. And same on the point around kind of what pervasive mental disorders were kind of accepted to be used in the DSM-5. And what I mean by grandfathered is that people who received the DSM-4 diagnosis of either autistic disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, otherwise specified, or Asperger Syndrome would be assumed to have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis from the DSM-5. So basically, the reason this was done was to prevent people from losing support they had basically got from an autism diagnosis. Because when you get an autism diagnosis, you officially count as being disabled, and you get access to various rights, support packages, and other bits and pieces. But this is quite an important point, which I'll kind of get onto later. I'm going to be spending the next couple of slides just briefly capping the important implications for Newton's research and wider scholarship for Phil Christie's argument around PDA being part of the autism spectrum. The first point to point out is that PDA is quite clearly not an autism spectrum disorder, which kind of... Let's move on to the next point. The next point is that Newton's Pervasive Developmental Disorders diagnostic grouping does not conform to accepted versions of the Pervasive Developmental Disorders diagnostic grouping, especially not the one that she would tend to refer to in her own kind of work, which is the DSM-4. Due to the differences between the versions of the Pervasive Developmental Disorders groupings that we use, so like the DSM-4 version versus Newton's, they're not the same thing. They're not even remotely similar in many respects, because Newton's one is clinically broad. It includes non-autistic people in it, quite substantial numbers of non-autistic people as well. That you cannot just blindly assume that autism. You cannot blindly assume that PDA is an autism spectrum disorder from Newton's work. There's also next point is there is no valid autism subtypes. Either through assigning support packages or even in clinical or research practices. And this has, in many respects, quite profound ramifications for what Phil Christie is actually arguing as part of his rationale for PDA being part of the autism spectrum. So he would argue that PDA is a pervasive developmental disorder, yet it clearly is not an autism spectrum disorder. He would then argue that autism subtypes almost certainly exist, and that, but I point out, yet we clearly know that they do not exist. He would then argue that that Newton said that PDA was a pervasive developmental disorder. Yet we also know that that Newton's pervasive developmental disorders diagnostic grouping is not the same as DSM-4's one, does not conform to accepted definitions of it. He would then also argue that PDA is an ASD in a broader autism spectrum disorder, so part of a broader autism phenotype. Yet again, there's no consensus over what broader autism phenotype is, or any acceptance for what broader autism phenotype means as part of diagnostic practice. It should be quite clear to people just to work out just how absurd Phil Christie's arguments are. PDA is part of the autism spectrum, and how they just do not hold up when kind of conceptualized in Newton's own work and broader literature on the topic. I'm spending the next 2 or 3 slides just quickly kind of covering even broader kind of arguments that are relevant to kind of Phil Christie's arguments around around PDA being part of the autism spectrum. So it is mentioned elsewhere in the PDA literature, especially more recently, that PDA features and PDA behaviours are seen in non-autistic persons. This matters especially when people argue that PDA should be used in clinical practice to protect individuals from receiving automatic reinforcement-based approaches, and therefore potentially being harmed or damaged, kind of like psychologically, and their well-being being adversely impacted by the automatic use of reinforcement-based approaches. And this matters because due to non-autistic people having similar cause mechanisms for displaying PDA behaviours, they will also be kind of exposed to common automatic reinforcement-based approaches that are used with kind of disruptive behaviour disorders. What this tells us is that one can argue legitimately for PDA to be used outside of autism for non-autistic people who show PDA behaviours, because one, it means that PDA can provide a sense of can provide an understanding for these behaviours seen in non-autistic people, and that these non-autistic people should receive appropriate support strategies due to receiving a PDA diagnosis, which kind of meet Phil Christie's two main arguments for using PDA in clinical practice. Just like the previous slide, I have previously used this point in the previous video, but I'm going to restate it again because it is actually pertinent. So Phil Christie would reference this quote by Goldberg 2013 in his conference talks, and the quote is both ICD and DSM focus more on the reliability than the validity of disorders they describe. He then goes on to say that no iteration of either DSM or ICD has acknowledged the fundamental distinction between researchers and practitioners. Then goes on to say who uses diagnostic classifications and for what purpose. That's the end of the quote. So what this quote means is that essentially no edition of the two main diagnostic manuals particularly cares who uses what diagnostic entity with what diagnostic grouping. The implication of that is that any particular stakeholder group can use a diagnostic entity on any particularly given population if they think it will help someone. It may not even have to help those being diagnosed with the diagnostic entity. So what this means is as Phil Christie he argues the two main justifications for PDA to be used in diagnostic practice is that it provides better understanding of a person's behaviours, and that it should better inform support packages. And this quote basically is a way of kind of getting around how PDA lacks a good quality evidence base. But I'd point out that this quote by Goldberg that Phil Christie uses is applicable for using PDA in non-autistic persons, as I kind of set out on the previous slide. I mentioned this in the previous talk on PDA ethics, that ethically researchers should not be favouring any particular one outlook over another, and kind of just viewing PDA to be part of the autism spectrum is quite clearly doing that if you're ignoring how other people are saying that PDA is seen outside of autism. Has quite profound ethical implications, but also it can have quite profound legal implications due to the next point, which is some PDA is an ASD kind of proponents have argued that individuals are entitled to PDA diagnosis under universal rights from, in particular in this case, from the Convention on the Rights of a Child. So they've argued that if it's in the best interest of a child to receive a PDA diagnosis, they should do that. Such arguments would also be applicable for using PDA in non-autistic people. But I'd also point out it's not ethical to deny someone a PDA diagnosis just because you view PDA to be part of the autism spectrum. And there is legal ramifications that you'll be breaching their legal rights to a PDA diagnosis. Because my view is that ethically and legally I cannot discriminate against non-autistic persons with PDA in my own research and kind of and when I come around to do my studies as part of the PhD, I'd have to treat them the same as I treat autistic persons with PDA. I don't really want to make this point, but it is pertinent and should be worth mentioning that if you actually investigate or even just look up Phil Christie's clinical background and his kind of work experience, he has spent many decades working with vulnerable people, but the issue is his specialism is one is PDA, but his main work background is in a highly specialist autism settings. So in particular, it's from Sutherland House School, which is based locally in Nottingham to me, but also the attached diagnostic centre, which is called Elizabeth Newton Centre, which he helped set up. And it's worth mentioning that Phil Christie assisted Elizabeth Newton in developing the kind of PDA as a diagnostic entity, as a distinct syndrome, like researching it, and kind of proposing it. But the issue with this is that his background is not as diverse as other kind of PDA experts and other authors, especially some ones who have argued that PDA is seen out in non-autistic people. The point I'm making here is that Phil Christie cannot really say from his clinical experience how PDA presents outside of the autistic population. And I know from attending his conference talks, especially his last one in 2009, the last one I attended was in 2019, at the NAS one, the National Autistic Society one, in November 2019 in Birmingham. Yeah, someone asked for so it asked a question which Phil Christie responded that PDA is a rare autism sometime. So Phil Christie does seem to view PDA as being part of the autism spectrum, and that is not that common. The problem is that view is directly contradicted by people of comparable, if not comparable, kind of expert status, but if not even more so. For example, a quite prominent one is Christopher Gilberg, who I would argue is much more respected than Phil Christie is, and much more recognised than Phil Christie is. And Christopher Gilberg's contribution to many areas of mental disorders research is quite profound. Christopher Gilbert views Pda to be quite common, and he says it can be seen in quite a lot of diagnostic and a lot of conditions. As well, so his outlook on PDA is quite diverse, and I don't think Phil Christie has the clinical background to sufficiently challenge Christopher Gilbert's outlook. This is quite important because if Christopher Gilbert is right that PDA is much more common than what Phil Christie thinks, and Phil Christie lacks the essentially the clout to challenge Gilbert, we shouldn't be placing Phil Christie's views on the diagnostic status of PDA over Christopher Gilbert's or others. And bear in mind that you have many other respected names saying that PDA is seen outside of autism. So the Jonathan Green et al. Paper in one of the Lancet derivative journals, they said that PDA is seen outside of autism, and this includes like Le Cantor and Emily Siminoff, as well as Jonathan Green. So these are names that are as much, if not more, respected than Phil Christie's are saying it, and also have much more diverse background experience to Phil Christie. So it's kind of important in relation towards whose opinion do you take more seriously on a particularly given area. Yeah, I mean, I need to be clear what I am saying and what I'm not saying. So, for example, I mean, I fully accept that PDA in most definitions can be seen in autistic persons in some capacity. What I am saying is that PDA itself, as a diagnostic entity, is not a form of autism. I think that's demonstrably true. I fully accept that people who have PDA or receive the PDA diagnosis do have can often have substantial level needs, and even if they don't have substantial level needs, they often will need specific strategies that are associated with PDA. So I'm not ever going to kind of challenge that. I mean, I think we should be challenging. I think we should be fully accepting, validating the lived experience around PDA, and especially the kind of the difficulties that not only those with lived experience face, but also the kind of the caregivers and family members around them also face. And I kind of make this I should have made this quite clear in my previous video around PDA ethics. I also fully accept that PDA can better describe a person than autism can do. Again, I've said this elsewhere in my work, but I'm just trying to restate that here. Despite all these features, just because PDA is often diagnosed in autistic people, it does not inherently mean that PDA is part of the autism spectrum, or it is an autism profile, or an autism subgroup, or anything of the kind. It just means they're just diagnosing it in autism. And I think this is something that is often overlooked. Yeah, I mean, I fully accept that Phil Christie assisted Elizabeth Newson in developing PDA as a diagnostic entity. Again, likewise, I fully accept that he's knowledgeable and experienced in working with autistic persons who express PDA features. That he should be quite knowledgeable on Newson's work and Newson's outlook. Some people might point out that Phil Christie might have been told by Newson later on that she changed her mind on it. My issue with that is I don't think that would be credible, because if she did that, he would have said it in print by now. Someone would have said it in print by now, and they just haven't done that. They just haven't done that. So I don't see. To me, it would be equivalent of, how can I put it? It'd be like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And I wouldn't treat it as being credible to some extent, because it would have by now, considering the scrutiny around Pda and the controversy around it, and the fact how it quite clearly is not autism, and Newton's consistent scholarship and writing on that is not autism. If Newton said it was said she thought it was autism, that would have been said somewhere in print. They would have shown it quite clearly, and that just hasn't happened. Yeah. I accept that largely Phil Christie means well, as well, and that he's trying to help people by arguing that Pda is part of the autism spectrum. I just don't think his argument or his case he puts forward is credible, and I think it is potentially harmful nonsense. I also don't think it's ethical, and I also think it discriminates against those who are non-autistic and have Pda. Yeah, I mean, I kind of done the last one, which is it's been a good reason to ignore that Pda is not it's part of the autism spectrum. Yeah, just some concluding comments. One, Pda is not part of the autism spectrum. Arguments behind PDAs and ASD do not hold up in wider or often more contemporary literature. PDA is, I would argue, is a new type of mental disorder based on Newton's work. The reason for this is because Newton made a own new diagnostic grouping that does not conform to any other diagnostic grouping that I'm aware of in the literature. So, and considering how Newton's definition for pervasive developmental disorders is essentially the same as pervasive developmental coding disorders, the logical extension that is Pda is something new. I mean, I'll go into more detail how I think Pda should be placed within the OCD and related disorders diagnostic group, even if it's only temporarily, in a later video. Yeah, I also think Pda should be diagnosed in non-autistic people. But I kind of cover reasons for that in a different talk. Yeah, this is just basically my contact details slide. So this should be self-explanatory. So this is my email, Twitter handle. You can do my ResearchGate, see where you can find much of my work, and in fact, most of my scholarship is on there if it's in print. This should be the last audio recording for this talk. So the remaining slides are just references. Not all the individual references listed are actually cited in the actual talk. The reason for this is that I adopted some slides from a talk that I used to deliver Pda seminars with postgraduate students. So I didn't see the point in just blindly removing references in. What I did is I just added a new final slide with any new references in on. So I hope that. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I hope you kind of engage with my kind of videos in the future.